Apache girl built a house by the lake. What she found under the bridge shocked everyone. The bones were arranged in perfect circles. Ayana stared down at the excavation site, her shovel frozen. In midair, she had been digging for 3 days, preparing the foundation for her new house by the remote lake. The work was supposed to be simple. Clear the ground, dig deep, build her dream of independence away from everyone and everything. But the bones weren't supposed to be there, and they certainly weren't supposed to be arranged like this. 7 complete skeletons, positioned in a ceremonial pattern she didn't recognize. Their hands were folded over small objects she couldn't identify from above. Between them, pieces of cloth that looked far too preserved for something that should have been buried for decades. The strangest part wasn't the bones themselves. It was how organized they were. How intentional, as if someone had taken great care to place each one exactly where it needed to be. Ayana had chosen this spot specifically because the old-timers in town always said the same thing. Nothing ever happened by that bridge. Nothing worth talking about. Anyway, they'd look away when they said it, the way people do when they're telling a lie that's become a habit. She climbed out of the pit and walked toward the weathered wooden bridge that crossed the narrow creek. From up here, she could see her excavation site clearly. The circular pattern of bones was even more obvious from this angle. That's when she noticed something else. The bridge planks directly above where she'd been digging were different from the rest. Newer wood, different color, as if someone had replaced just that section recently. Ayana knelt and pried up one of the newer planks with her hands. Underneath, carved deep into the original wood beam, were symbols she'd never seen before. Not Apache, not any Native American marking she recognized, but someone had gone to great trouble to hide them. As she traced the symbols with her finger, a voice behind her made her freeze. "You shouldn't have dug there, girl." Ayana spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sterling Boone stood 20 feet away, his weathered face grim under the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't heard his horse. Nothing. The old man moved like smoke when he wanted to. "Mr. Boone." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I didn't see you coming." Sterling's pale eyes fixed on the excavation site behind her, taking in the circular pattern of bones still visible in the dirt. His jaw worked silently, as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow. "That's because I know these paths better than most." He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry grass. "Been riding them since before you were born. Question is, what exactly did you think you were building here?" Ayana straightened her shoulders. She bought this land fair and square, saved every coin for 3 years working at the trading post. "A house? My house? On my property? Your property?" Sterling's laugh held no humor. "Child, do you have any idea where you are? What this place means?" She gestured toward the bones. "I know there are people buried here who shouldn't be. People arranged in patterns that don't make sense, and I know everyone in town pretends this spot doesn't exist." Sterling dismounted his horse with the careful movements of a man whose joints remembered too many hard years. He walked to the edge of her excavation and stared down at the skeletons. The muscle in his cheek twitched. Some secrets stay buried for good reason. Whose secrets? Ayana moved to stand beside him. Up close, she could see the deep lines carved around his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly before he clenched them into fists. Who were these people? Families? The word fell from Sterling's lips like a stone into still water. Apache. Families like yours camped here during the winter of '69. Peaceful camp. Women, children, old ones. The pit in Ayana's stomach deepened. What happened to them? Sterling turned away from the excavation. Same thing that always happened. White men decided they were in the way. But the arrangement of the bodies, the ceremony wasn't there. Ceremony. Sterling's voice dropped to, barely above a whisper, was ours, my father's, my uncle's. We came back the next spring, found what was left, had to do something proper for them, even if we couldn't do it right. Ayana felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not literally, she wasn't prone to flights of fancy, but the weight of understanding settling over her like a heavy blanket. Your family buried them. My family tried to give them dignity. Sterling mounted his horse again. But some folks in town, they've got investments in forgetting. Big investments. And they won't take kindly to you digging up their past. He turned his horse toward town, then paused. Pack up and leave, girl. Tonight there's nothing here but old pain and new trouble. As Sterling disappeared into the tree inn, Ayana looked back at the excavation site. 7 families, men, women, children, arranged with care by people who loved them enough to risk returning to a place of slaughter. But Sterling had been wrong about one thing. She could see wagon wheel ruts leading away from the bridge. Ruts that looked fresh. Someone else had been here recently, someone who might not want the world to know what Sterling's family had tried to preserve. Ayana knelt beside the wagon wheel ruts, running her fingers along the compressed earth. The tracks were deep, consistent with a heavily loaded wagon, and the edges of the ruts were still sharp. These weren't from months ago. Someone had hauled something heavy through here within the past few weeks. She followed the trail away from the bridge, noting how it curved through the trees toward town before veering off toward the old mining road. Whoever had made these tracks knew the area well enough to avoid the main paths. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as she traced the route. After half a mile, the wagon tracks met up with horse prints, multiple horses all shod. A group had gathered here, then continued together toward the abandoned silver mine. At the convergence point, something caught her eye, a piece of fabric snagged on a low branch too high for a normal person to have left it there. Someone tall had passed this way, or someone on horseback. The fabric was wool dyed, deep blue, expensive cloth, not the rough cotton most folks around here could afford. Ayana tucked the fabric into her shirt pocket and continued following the trail. The path grew steeper as it climbed toward the mine, and the wagon ruts became less distinct in the rocky soil, but the horse prints remained clear. At least 6 different animals. The old silver mine sat in a natural hollow between 2 ridges, its entrance boarded up with weathered planks, but the boards had been moved recently. She could see fresh scratches in the wood where they'd been pried loose and then repositioned. She approached the mine entrance carefully, listening for any sounds from within. Nothing but the whisper of wind through the mountains. The boards weren't nailed in place anymore, just leaning against the opening. Someone had made this mine accessible again, but wanted it to look abandoned. Ayana moved one board aside and peered into the darkness. The air that drifted out smelled of dust and something else, something metallic and stale. Not the fresh scent of recently disturbed earth, but the smell of things long buried being moved around. She was about to step inside when hoof-beats echoed up the trail behind her. Fast hoof-beats coming her way. Ayana quickly repositioned the board and scrambled up the rocky slope to a cluster of boulders that offered cover. 3 riders appeared in the hollow below. The first was Colton Miles, a prosperous rancher whose spread bordered the lake property. She recognized his distinctive gray stallion and the silver conchos on his saddle. The second rider, she didn't recognize, a thin man in a black suit who sat his horse like he'd rather be anywhere else. The third rider made her blood run cold. Nora Harrow, the woman who ran the general store and served as unofficial mayor of their small town. Nora, who'd been so helpful when Ayana was looking for land to buy, who'd steered her specifically toward The lake property, saying it was perfect for a young woman wanting privacy. She found them. All right, Colton was saying as the three riders dismounted. Sterling came into town white as a sheet, saying she dug up the hole. Burial site. How much does she know? The thin man's voice carried a nervous edge. Nora's response chilled Iona, too. The bone. Doesn't matter what she knows. Now, question is, how do we make sure she doesn't know anything tomorrow? The three moved toward the mine entrance, and Iona realized with growing horror that she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a cover-up of historical injustice. These people weren't just trying to hide the past. They were actively planning to silence her. Iona pressed herself deeper into the shadows between the boulders. As the three conspirators moved the boards aside and disappeared into the mine, she waited, counting her heartbeats until she was certain they were far enough inside that she couldn't hear their voices anymore. Then she crept down from her hiding spot and positioned herself near the mine entrance, straining to catch fragments of their conversation, echoing from within. Documents are all here. Colton's voice drifted out. Original survey maps showing the Apache camp was temporary. Not enough. That was Nora. She's seen the burial site, knows. It was deliberate. The thin man's voice was harder to make out, but Iona caught enough. Railroad contract worth more than this whole territory. Her blood chilled as the pieces began falling into place. A railroad contract. Survey maps that falsely showed the Apache camp as temporary rather than permanent. Documents hidden in an abandoned mine that could prove the massacre had been orchestrated to clear the land for railroad development. Can't just disappear her like the others. Nora's voice carried a sharp edge of frustration. Too many people saw her in town. No, she bought the land. Others, they made other people disappear. Iona's hand shook as she realized how thoroughly she'd been manipulated. Nora hadn't just helped her find the perfect, isolated property. She'd steered her to the exact spot where the evidence was buried, knowing that eventually someone would have to excavate the area for construction. But why? Why guide her to discover what they'd worked so hard to conceal? Accident. Colton was saying. Construction accident. Foundation. Cave in. Bury her with the evidence. The thin man's words were clearer now as the three moved closer to the entrance. Two birds with one stone. Iona backed away from the mine opening, her mind racing. They weren't just planning to kill her. They were planning to stage her death as an accident and bury her with the skeletal remains, making it look like she died in a foundation collapse that conveniently destroyed all the evidence of the historical massacre. She turned and ran, no longer caring about stealth. The rocky path bit at her feet as she stumbled down the mountainside, branches tearing at her clothes. Behind her, she heard shouts. They discovered she was gone by the time she reached the lake. Her lungs burned and her legs trembled. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. She had to get to her excavation site. Had to document what she'd found before they could destroy it all. The 7 skeletons lay undisturbed in their circular pattern. But now Iona saw them differently. These weren't just victims of an old massacre. They were witnesses, evidence of a crime that powerful people had spent decades covering up, willing to kill again to keep their secrets buried. She knelt beside the closest skeleton and carefully began removing the small objects clutched in its hands. A child's carved wooden doll, a woman's silver hairpin, personal items that proved these people had been living here, not just passing through. The thundering of hoof beats echoed across the lake. They'd found her trail. Iona stuffed the artifacts into her shirt and scrambled toward her half-built house. Foundation. If she was going to die here, she'd at least try to leave evidence of what she'd discovered. But as she reached her construction materials, she spotted something that made her freeze. A fresh grave hastily dug behind her would pile and protruding from the disturbed earth. The corner of a leather document case. Ayana dropped to her knees and clawed at the loose dirt around the leather document case. It came free easily, too easily. Someone had buried it recently, probably within the last few days. The leather was still, supple, unmarked by moisture or time. Inside the case, her worst fears materialized into damning evidence. Railroad survey documents dating back to 1869, signed by territorial officials. She recognized from the plaques in the town hall maps showing proposed rail lines that would run directly through the Apache winter camp, and most horrifying of all, correspondence between railroad executives and local authorities discussing the removal of impediments to progress. One letter made her stomach turn. The Apache situation at the lake crossing has been resolved permanently. Construction may proceed as scheduled. Payment as agreed delivered to specified parties. The hoof beatots were getting closer. Ayana stuffed the documents inside her shirt with the artifacts and looked frantically around for an escape route, but the lake stretched behind her. The mountains rose to her left, and the riders were approaching from the only path back to town. She was trapped. Miss Ayana. Nora's voice rang out across the clearing, dripping with false concern. We saw smoke from your campfire and came to check on you. Are you hurt? The three riders emerged from the tree and up close. Ayana could see that Nora's usual warm smile had vanished, replaced by the cold calculation of a woman who'd built her wealth on other people's graves. Colton Miles sat his horse like a man preparing for a fight, his hand resting on the rifle scabbard at his saddle. The thin man in black kept glancing nervously at the excavation site. I'm fine, Mrs. Harrow, Ayana called back, trying to keep her voice steady. Just working on my foundation. Oh, child. Nora dismounted and walked closer, her boots crunching on the scattered bones at the edge of the excavation. This is no place for a young woman to live alone. Too many dangers. What kind of dangers? The kind that come from digging where you shouldn't. Colton had drawn his rifle and was holding it casually, but the barrel pointed in her general direction. The kind that come from asking questions about things that don't concern you. The thin man finally spoke. Miss, I'm Thomas Whitmore, representative of the Continental Railroad Company. We have a significant business interest in this property, and we're prepared to make you a very generous offer for the land. This land isn't for sale. Everything's for sale, Nora said quietly. The question is whether you're selling to us or to the undertaker. Ayana's hand instinctively moved to the documents hidden in her shirt. You guided me here. You wanted me to find the bodies. Clever girl. Nora's smile returned, but it was the expression of a predator circling wounded prey. We needed someone to discover the remains officially. Someone whose word couldn't be questioned. A young Apache woman finding the bones of her own people. Very compelling testimony if anyone ever came asking questions. But you plan to kill me. Afterward, eventually. Yes, after you'd served your purpose and identified the remains as Apache victims of some long-forgotten conflict. Nothing more than historical curiosity. You understand? Certainly nothing that would interfere with railroad development. Colton raised his rifle to his shoulder. Problem is, you've learned too much. Can't have you running to the territorial authorities with wild stories about cover-ups and conspiracies. Ayana backed toward the edge of the lake, her boots sinking into the muddy shore. The cold water lapped at her heels. Behind the three riders, the shadows were lengthening as the sun dropped toward the mountains. Wait, she said, raising her hands. There's something you don't know. Something I found that changes everything. Thomas. Whitmore held up his hand, stopping. Colton from pulling the trigger. What did you find? Ayanna pulled out one of the artifacts, the silver hairpin, and held it up where they could see it. This belonged to Maria Vasquez, the daughter of Don Carlos Vasquez. She was engaged to marry the son of a prominent territorial judge. The three conspirators exchanged glances. Nora's confident expression flickered. "You're lying," she said. "The hairpin has her family crest engraved on it. If Maria Vasquez died in this massacre, it wasn't just Apache families who were killed. It was also the daughter of one of the most powerful Mexican landowners in the territory." But even as she spoke, Ayanna could see in their faces that she'd just signed her death warrant, because now they knew she'd found evidence that could bring down not just railroad executives, but territorial officials, judges, and anyone else who'd profited from the systematic murder of inconvenient people. The rifle shot echoed across the lake just as Sterling Boone's voice rang out from the tree. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Sterling Boone stepped out from behind a cluster of pine trees, his rifle trained on Colton Miles. But he wasn't alone. 3 other men emerged from different positions around the clearing, all armed, all with their weapons ready. "Lower your rifle, Colton," Sterling said calmly. "We've heard enough." Colton's face went pale, but he kept his rifle aimed at Ayanna. "This doesn't concern you, old man. Walk away." "It concerns me plenty." One of the other men stepped forward, a grizzled rider Ayanna recognized as Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison, though he wasn't wearing his badge, especially when I hear talk about murdering young women and covering up railroad conspiracies. Thomas Whitmore raised his hand slowly. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're simply here to make Miss Ayanna a business proposition, the kind of business proposition that requires rifles?" Sterling asked. "The kind where you bury the customer with a contract." Nora's composure finally cracked. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. The railroad brings progress to this territory, jobs, commerce, a future for everyone. Build on the bones of murdered families," Sterling replied. "Build on lies and cover-ups that go all the way to the territorial capital." Ayanna saw her chance. While the men faced off, she pulled the railroad documents from her shirt. "I have the correspondence between Continental Railroad and territorial officials. Signed agreements to remove impediments from the rail line route, payment, receipts to local authorities for services rendered. Those documents are forged," Whitmore said quickly, but his nervous glance toward Nora betrayed him. "Are they?" Deputy Marshal Morrison stepped closer to Ayanna. "May I see those papers, miss?" She handed them over, watching Morrison's expression grow darker as he read. "These are signed by Judge Harold Ashford and Territorial Governor Edmund Hayes. Both men I know personally." He looked up at Whitmore. "Both men who've been pushing for rapid railroad expansion through Apache territories. You don't understand the bigger picture," Nora said desperately. "The railroad brings civilization. It connects us to the rest of the country. A few Apache families and some Mexican. Girl, what does that matter against progress?" The casual dismissal of Maria Vasquez's life was too much for Ayanna. Maria Vasquez wasn't just some Mexican girl. She was the daughter of Don Carlos Vasquez, who owns 300,000 acres of prime grazing land. Her disappearance would have been investigated. Would have been, Nora agreed. But Don Carlos received word that his daughter eloped with a traveling merchant and moved to California. We even provided witnesses who claimed to have seen her boarding a stagecoach. Sterling's jaw tightened. "More lies, more cover-ups. How many people have you killed to keep this quiet?" "Fewer than will die if the railroad doesn't get built," Colton said. "Fewer than will starve when the cattle markets collapse and the mines play out. Sometimes progress requires sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" Morrison spat. "You mean murder?" The standoff stretched taut as a boring. Ayana could see the calculation in Nora's eyes, the way she was measuring distances and angles. The woman was planning something. There's one thing you're all forgetting, Nora said with a cold smile. The territorial governor and the judge aren't just names on documents. They're my business partners. When I don't return to town tonight, they'll send a full company of territorial militia to clean up this mess. Sterling's face went grim. How long do we have? They expect me back by midnight. It's nearly sunset now. Ayana felt the trap closing around them. Even with Sterling's help, even with the evidence, they were still outnumbered by the institutional power behind the conspiracy. But as she looked at the documents in Morrison's hands, she noticed something that made her heart race, a detail she'd missed before, hidden in the formal language of the correspondence. The conspiracy was even bigger than they'd realized, and the evidence to expose it was right there in black ink. Ayana stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. The territorial militia won't come to help you, Mrs. Harrow. Nora's confident smile faltered. What are you talking about? I can read and I can add. Ayana pointed to the documents in Morrison's hands. Those payment receipts aren't just for the massacre. They show payments to territorial officials for land grants, mining rights, and military contracts dating back 5 years. But look at the amounts. Morrison scanned the papers again, his expression growing more troubled. These payments, they're massive, far more than any single railroad contract would justify. Because it's not just about the railroad, Ayana continued. The railroad is only the first step. Look at the survey maps. The proposed rail line runs directly through 3 major Apache reservations, the richest silver mining territory in the region, and the best grazing land for cattle. Thomas Whitmore's face had gone ashen. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. This isn't about building one railroad line. You're planning to steal every valuable piece of land in the territory by claiming it's needed for railroad development. The Apache massacres, the disappearances, the cover-ups. It's all to clear people off land you want to claim. Sterling whistled low. Land grab. Biggest one I've ever heard of. And the territorial governor gets his cut from every acre seized. Morrison added, his voice grim. That's why he'd send militia to clean up. He's not protecting a railroad company. He's protecting his own criminal empire. Nora's mask finally slipped completely. You think you're so clever, girl. But even if you're right, what can you do about it? Who will you tell? The territorial authorities are all bought and paid for. The federal marshals are 300 m away. The newspapers are owned by men who profit from railroad development. There is someone, Ayana said quietly. She pulled the silver hairpin from her shirt. Again, but this time she held it up to catch the dying sunlight. Engraved on the back, visible now in the better light, was not just the Vasquez family crest, but also another symbol. The seal of the Mexican consul general, Maria Vasquez, wasn't just Don Carlos's daughter. She was engaged to marry the son of the Mexican consul general in San Antonio. Her disappearance would have created a diplomatic incident between Mexico and the United States, unless the Mexican government received convincing evidence that she died naturally, Sterling finished, or that she was killed by hostile Apache raiders, which is exactly what they were. Told, Morrison said, understanding dawning on his face. The territorial governor used the massacre to blame Apache raiders for Maria's death, avoiding an international incident while covering up the land grab. Colton's rifle was shaking now. None of this matters. You're all dead. Every last one of you. We can't let you leave this place alive. But before anyone could react to Colton's threat, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the lake. Many horses coming fast from the direction of town. The militia, Nora, said with renewed confidence. Right on. Schedule. Iona counted the hoof. Beatots. At least 20 riders, maybe more. Even if Sterling's group tried to fight, they'd be overwhelmed. Morrison grabbed her arm. We need to run now. There's nowhere to run. Colton laughed. They've got the whole area surrounded. But as the first riders appeared through the trees, Iona saw something that made her heart leap with hope. The man leading the cavalry charge wasn't wearing the uniform of territorial militia. He was wearing the distinctive blue coat and brass buttons of a United States Federal Marshal. Federal Marshal Robert Carrington rode into the clearing with the authority of a man who'd spent 20 years bringing justice to lawless territories. Behind him, a full company of federal cavalry spread out in a practiced formation that left no avenue of escape. Nobody move, Carrington commanded, his voice carrying across the lake. This is a federal investigation. Nora Harrow's confident expression crumbled like a house built on sand. Thomas Whitmore raised his hands. Immediately, his face pale with the realization that territorial protection meant nothing against federal authority. Colton Miles, however, made the mistake of trying to swing his rifle toward the marshal. The nearest cavalry trooper put a bullet through Colton's shoulder before he could complete the motion, sending him sprawling beside the excavation site. Marshal Carrington, Deputy Marshal Morrison stepped forward. Thank God you received our message. Your message? Carrington dismounted and surveyed the scene. The exposed skeletons arranged in their ceremonial circle, the scattered documents, the obvious signs of a confrontation. Son, we've been tracking this conspiracy for 6 months. The Mexican Consul General filed a formal complaint with Washington about his future daughter-in-law's suspicious disappearance. When our investigation started uncovering bribes to territorial officials, we knew we had something big. Iona felt a wave of relief wash over her. How did you know to come here? We didn't. Exactly. We followed Thomas Whitmore from Denver, expecting him to lead us to evidence of the railroad land fraud. We never imagined we'd find a mass grave and the smoking gun documents all in one place. Sterling stepped forward, his weathered face grim. Marshal, that grave site contains the remains of 7 Apache families, murdered in 1869 to clear the land for railroad development. This young woman's excavation uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reaches all the way to the territorial governor. Carrington examined the documents Morrison handed him, his expression growing darker with each page. These payment receipts, these correspondence, gentlemen, we're looking at the largest criminal conspiracy in territorial history. Marshal Iona said, pulling the silver hairpin from her pocket. This belonged to Maria Vasquez. I found it in the hands of one of the victims. She was killed alongside the Apache families, and the territorial governor covered it up by blaming hostile raiders. Thomas Whitmore finally broke. I want to make a deal. I'll testify against everyone. The governor, the judge, all of them. I have records of every bribe, every forged document, every illegal land transfer. You'll testify regardless, Carrington said coldly. The only question is whether you do it from a jail cell or from coffin. Nora Harrow made one last desperate play. Marshal, you don't understand the economics of this territory. Without the railroad, without development, everyone here will starve. We did what was necessary for the greater good. You murdered 23 people, including a Mexican diplomat's daughter-in-law, to steal their land, Carrington replied. There's no greater good in mass murder and conspiracy. As the federal cavalry secured the prisoners, Iona walked to the edge of the burial site. The afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows across the exposed bones of families who have been denied justice for over a decade. They'll receive proper burial now, Sterling said quietly, joining her beside the excavation. Apache ceremony like they should have had originally. What happens to the land? Ayanna asked. Marshal Carrington overheard. Federal court will sort that out. But I suspect a young woman who helped expose the biggest criminal conspiracy in territorial history might find herself with clear title to whatever property she wants. Ayanna looked around the clearing at the lake, where she planned to build her house, at the bridge where so many secrets had been buried, at the place where her simple desire for independence had uncovered a web of corruption that stretched from territorial capitals to international diplomatic offices. What I want, she said finally, is for people to remember what really happened here. But even as the federal cavalry prepared to escort the prisoners back to town for trial, Ayanna noticed something that made her heart sink. In all the commotion, no one had been watching the old mine where the conspirators had hidden their most damaging evidence. 3 months later, Ayanna stood before a packed courtroom in Denver as federal Judge William Hammond delivered the sentences that would echo through territorial history. Territorial. Governor Edmund Hayes, you are sentenced to life in federal prison for conspiracy, murder, and treason. Judge Harold Ashford, you will serve 25 years for accepting bribes and obstruction of justice. Nora Harrow, Thomas Whitmore, and Colton Miles, you are each sentenced to 15 years for your roles in this conspiracy. The evidence from a mine had been devastating. When Marshal Carrington's men had searched the abandoned silver mine, they'd found not just the railroad documents, but also detailed records of 12 other cleared properties representing the systematic murder of over 60 people across 5 years. The conspiracy had been even larger than anyone imagined. Ayanna had testified for 3 days, describing her discovery of the burial site, the artifacts that proved the victims' identities, and the conversations she'd overheard. Her testimony had been crucial in connecting the territorial officials to the railroad conspiracy. But the moment that truly shocked the courtroom and the newspaper reporters who carried the story across the country came when she presented the final piece of evidence she discovered in the mine. Maria Vasquez's engagement ring engraved with the seal of the Mexican consul general, along with a letter she'd written to her father before her death. A letter that proved she hadn't eloped to California, but had been specifically targeted because her marriage would have created powerful Mexican political connections that threatened the land grab conspiracy. The systematic murder of Apache families was horrific enough, Judge Hammond had said during the trial, but the deliberate killing of Maria Vasquez to prevent international scrutiny represents a level of criminal calculation that shocks the conscience of any civilized society. Now, as Ayanna walked out of the courthouse, she carried with her the federal deed to not just her original lake property, but to all the land that had been illegally seized by the conspiracy. The court had awarded her ownership as compensation for her role in exposing the crimes. Sterling Boone was waiting for her on the courthouse steps. So what will you do with 12,000 acres of prime territory land? Ayanna looked at the deed in her hands, then at the newspaper headline, visible through the vendor's window. Apache woman's discovery exposes massive territorial conspiracy. Federal investigation leads to dozens of arrests. I'm going to build that house by the lake, she said. But first, I'm going to build something else. 6 months later, the Vasquez Apache Memorial stood beside the lake where Ayanna had made her shocking discovery. The monument listed the names of all 63 confirmed victims of the land grab conspiracy, with Maria Vasquez's name prominently displayed alongside those of the Apache families. Ayana's house sat on a hill overlooking both the memorial and the clear waters of the lake. From her front porch, she could see the new bridge that had replaced the old one, a bridge built with proper foundations that would never hide secrets beneath its planks. The revelation that a young Apache woman's simple desire to build a house had exposed the largest criminal conspiracy in territorial history had indeed shocked everyone. From territorial capitals to Washington, D.C. to Mexico City, the story had traveled far beyond the courtroom, inspiring federal reforms and territorial governance and establishing new protections for Native American lands. But for Ayana, the most important outcome was simpler. The families buried in the ceremonial circle by the lake had finally received justice. Their names were known, their stories told, and their deaths would never again be dismissed as insignificant obstacles to progress. As she sat on her porch each evening, watching the sunset over the lake where she'd uncovered the truth, Ayana knew she had built more than just a house. She had built a legacy that would ensure the victims of the conspiracy would never be forgotten. The Apache girl who had simply wanted to build a house by the lake had instead built a monument to justice that would stand long after she was gone. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage meets destiny in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.